Dear friends, welcome back to Lit Space after a long break. Such a delay occurred because of the lockdown, and this was the time when I was also preoccupied with a lot of work. I think that you've been able to protect yourselves from the raging pandemic. Well, it seems we have to keep on fighting this vicious disease for a little while longer. Today we are going to discuss an Indian poem in English. I take this up because it promises to engage with certain deep primal puzzles. This poem, titled Home, written by one of our contemporary poets, Arundhathi Subramaniam, creates ripples of thought that start off from its central theme of home. Well, more of this later when we get entangled in the poem. Let's get started. The poem opens with a paradoxical plea. The female speaker in the poem wants a home, one that paradoxically doesn't belong to her, one that she doesn't belong to either. This entreaty looks strange, coming as it does from a talented woman. Barely a century ago, Virginia Woolf had made a vehement case for a woman to have a room of her own. Our protagonist is ready to relinquish hers, not just the room with the books, but the whole of the home, in exchange for one which wouldn't bother her too much, where perhaps she would be more like a guest than an inmate. She mentions a few things that shouldn't pester her in the new home, like problems with the plumbing, keeping the books in order, being concerned about the shade of the curtains, and being worried about relationships which are strained by inflated ego. A few days back, I listened to an interpretation of the poem. The interpreter was trying to put a feminist construction on this poem. According to this contention, the atmosphere in the home is oppressive, so oppressive that the speaker decides to quit and dream of a new home. Perhaps the interpreter takes her cue from expressions like yesterday's conversation, the self doesn't bloat, etc. She takes them to refer to quarrels. This is too naive a way of reading the poem. She leaves key images of the poem unexplained. It's not a fault as she picks up only one strand for analysis. I'm not saying that the things that she would like to leave behind are unimportant. On the contrary, they are vital to our understanding of the poem. The question we should ask is why she wants to leave. What is certain is that she wants a home that's light for her to wear. That leads us on to the idea of the space being clogged with yesterday's unpleasant residue, with the ill feelings it brings in. The contrast between light and clogged is too plain for us to ignore. Ease of movement, slipping in and out without leaving a trace, rooms uncluttered by giant-sized cells are what she longs for. And the word wear fits in with the suggestion of breast-like weightlessness. It not only adds to the sense of unhampered movement, but leads on to the glaring paradox of the last section. The hindrances that she speaks about are not physical, such as domestic chores found in most feminist writings. The only exception is the messy pile of books. She cannot put the blame on anyone else for this. It's a thing of her own making, a thing that we must assume she is fond of. This is one of the paradoxes. She wants to rid herself of not just the books but the nagging concern about keeping them in order. So is her attitude to keeping the home pretty. Not that she dislikes it, but she would rather be rid of the headache. The point is that the plea for the new home doesn't arise from any deep dislike. All this, the things that she hates quite as much as those that she loves, assumes the form of a burden, including even reasoned conversations, not necessarily angry arguments, which is why her home should be light enough for her to wear, like dress upon her person. But the poet goes further. She compares home with the body. Both, she argues, are alien when we belong to them or when they belong to us. And conversely, if we relate to them in the guise of a visitor, both would be hospitable. we have reached the central pivotal paradox of the poem. She turns the idea of the outsider on its head. The stranger is at home and the inmate turns into an alien. Obviously, the poet is asking too much of the reader. We need to look more closely at the dynamics of the transformation. What is it that causes alienation? I do not wish to go outside the text in quest of theories. The poem enumerates a few things as being responsible for the sense of alienation, of not being at home, of not really belonging. The image of the visitor must be seen in the context of this alienation. During his or her short stay, the visitor is pleased with the place he or she stays in, because, for one thing, he is disposed to be pleased. The place is made hospitable for him or her. The visitor does not contribute to the hospitality of the place. There are people, we should assume, who take care of the things that make for his or her comfort, such as plumbing or shade of the curtains. If they don't do, he or she will feel uncomfortable and alienated. That is to say, one's status as a visitor cannot ensure hospitality of a place. You cannot put yourself in the shoes of a visitor in your home. You are not supposed merely to enjoy the hospitality of your home. You are an inmate, and to see yourself as a guest doesn't make things any better. Home assumes the shape you give it, and the sweetness it gives you must necessarily be in proportion to your contribution, neither of which happens in the case of the visitor. Hence, the central paradox of the poem fails to acquire the depth of a perception and remains an unresolved contradiction. Aligning home with the body in the last section is a repetition of the same contradiction. Perhaps this is a case of contradictory lines of thought pulling tangentially at the theme of the poem. The feminist strand is obvious. There are things that make life unpleasant or even unbearable. We get the impression that tidying up the house and attending to the plumbing are things the poet has to worry about. And adding to it, what transpired recently between someone in the house and the speaker makes it worse. But what is surprising is that the major chunk of physical domestic work is left out in the poem. Should we presume that there are people engaged to take care of that? Her list of worries is trite. Perhaps by now the second strand of detachment makes itself dominant. The notion of a distant spiritual home and of life on earth as a sojourn clashes with the first strand. This contradiction is reflected in the insider-outsider dichotomy. Her ascetic indifference falls out of harmony with the general tone of domestic life. In short, the problems that the poet states cannot be solved by a readjustment of attitude. Look, for example, at the idea of giving and taking in the opening line. Perhaps the speaker is not serious about her philosophical apathy. Does she need a new home to be given to her? One would expect her to create it, in the sense of transforming the one she lives in. The sense of possession is implicit in the act of giving or taking. She expects it to be ready for occupation. And here, the poem seems to be a celebration of the speaker's withdrawal from the routine processes of life. We are not done with the poem yet. The home she dreams of, we have seen, must be light for her to wear. It would sit lightly on a visitor. Perhaps the craftsmanship of the poet is seen in the collation of the lightness of cloth and the indifference of the visitor's attitude. The transformation of the inmate into the guest is paralleled in the clogged room turning into light fabric. The whole imagery becomes complex with the comparison of the body with home. As has been pointed out earlier, the cloth, home, body trio suggests a duality. The speaker would identify with one of the components of the duality and claim absolute rapport. This is a poem about backing away from reality, physical reality, always waiting to receive, like hospitality, such as is enjoyed by a visitor. I am reminded of the ascetic in Tagore's play The Ascetic or the Sannyasi, where the man of detachment abandons a hapless girl, fearing attachment. This man sits in meditation by the wayside, priding himself on his liberation from karma. The girl who is rebuked by her mistress takes refuge in his lap and sleeps in the comfort of paternal protection. But as affection for the girl springs up in the arid ascetic mind, he leaves her and runs away. Later, overcome by guilt, he comes back in search of this girl, but he fails to track her. Before we conclude, a couple of words on the two streams of thought in the poem. One of these centers on the experiences of the woman, her being subjected to the duty of keeping home, her being subjected to gender-based discrimination. The other is concerned with the attainment of spiritual liberation, which is independent of gender. According to the first, the woman thinks that things would take care of themselves if she could keep away from the pressures of domestic life. This is more psychological than philosophical. The second preaches detachment through spiritual indifference. The two streams meet on the point of backsliding from reality. In a way, the speaker is making a case of adopting ascetic distancing to tackle the wearisome issues of mundane life. I think that you have enjoyed listening to this discussion of the poem. If so, I would like you to subscribe to this channel. Goodbye until we meet again with a different poem.